Moraine. To start off with, I'm going to begin with a little introduction and talk a bit about the Land Trust and the work that we do, and I'll give a land acknowledgement, and then I'll go into the presentation. So just give me 1 second here, and I will share my screen once more. All right, so thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to begin with our land acknowledgement. All right. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the nations of the Williams Treaty. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. We acknowledge that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent right to the land. We will continue to create a better future for our relationship with Indigenous peoples and the land. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. And we recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. So what does the Land Trust do? So about 90% of the land on the Oak Ridges Moraine is privately owned. So we work with landowners to help protect important habitats across the Oak Ridges Moraine. And we do that in perpetuity. We have 68 different properties which we protect, and we're legally obligated to protect them forever. So we can't change our mind in a few years and decide that we want to put a condo up. Land trusts are a type of environmental NGO, a nonprofit that can acquire land or interests in land. So a lot of what we have are called easements. So somebody might still live on their land, they might still even farm part of it, but part of that property is set aside legally as protected habitat. And we make sure that it is being protected and conserved for the benefit of wildlife and for people all across the region. We also raise funds to purchase land outright. We have a few fee simple properties, which we call our conservation reserves, including two out in Northumberland County that I'll talk about in a minute here. And people donate properties to us as well. How do we protect the moraine? Well, we contribute to the federal government's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030. We help connect people to nature. We do a lot of educational programming like we're doing tonight, but we also do things like bird walks, moth nights, bat nights. We did all sorts of fantastic programming in 2024. I think this is our last webinar and our last event we have scheduled for the year, but we have some fun stuff planned in 2025 already, which I'll chat about in a minute. But we do lots of stuff in person, but we also do a lot of great online presentations as well. And all of these presentations, unless the presenter requests otherwise, we record and share on our YouTube channel so people can watch them afterwards and enjoy them as much as they like in the future. We work to support climate change resiliency, which is, I'm sure, resonating with lots of people right now as we've seen an extremely warm November and December. It's a little disconcerting here in Southern Ontario right now. We protect green corridors, and we protect ecologically significant lands on and near the moraine. And as I mentioned before, we protect those lands in perpetuity. There's a couple of tools that we use for this. One of the ones that we get a lot of use out of is the Federal Ecological Gifts Program through our friends at Revenue Canada. That's a program that gives amazing tax incentives to people who donate their land outright or put conservation easements on it. And a lot of what we do is made possible through legacy giving as well. We receive substantial funds through people's wills, and then people will their properties to us as well. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, we have an exciting project out in Northumberland County, out by Ganaraska Forest. We have the Kirtland's Warbler Habitat Restoration Project. There's this endangered songbird called the Kirtland's Warbler, which only breeds around the Great Lakes. Most of them are found in Michigan, but a few of them breed in Ontario and Minnesota as well. And they're extremely picky about where they nest. They need to nest in two species of pine trees between about 5 and 15 years of age. Anything shorter or taller, older or younger than that, they don't like. And those trees, the jack pine and the red pine, typically require fire to germinate their cones. And so, with the suppression of indigenous land management practices like controlled burns after the arrival of European colonizers, a lot of species that depended on these oak pine habitats, which depended on cycles of forest fires and disturbance to generate, were severely impacted. And so we are restoring this lost oak pine habitat out in Northumberland County by planting lots of native species. We're doing things like collecting wildflower seeds and acorns and nuts from all sorts of things like hickories and any number of species that are found throughout the region. We've done webinars to help teach people about native plant identification. We've done some in-field seed collection days and some workshops around that. And we're always looking for people who are interested in volunteering with this project. I will throw a link in the chat before too long that links to the volunteer page of our website if anybody's interested in reaching out and volunteering with us or finding out more about this project. And like I mentioned, this is the last event we have planned for 2024. I think we had about 14 different webinars this year, and we had all sorts of in-person events. Like I mentioned, we had a moth and bat night, we had a spider walk, some winter tracking events, all sorts of fantastic things. We had a Pride Month queer ecology webinar and walk. And I'm looking forward to doing some more incredible programming in 2025. We have a volunteer training session coming up in January on the 14th for anyone who's interested in volunteering with us. We have a guided walk at the Beaton Heritage Forest in Beaton, Ontario coming up on January 17th. That's an owl prowl. So hopefully we'll hear some of the owls that are out there. We didn't have much luck last year, but fingers crossed that we'll hear them this year. We have a great webinar coming up on groundwater and its importance in the Oak Ridges Moraine in February, followed by a webinar in March about the reintroduction of an endangered butterfly called the mottled dusky wing, which depends on these two species of wildflower called New Jersey tea and prairie roodroot, which are closely related, which is part of the restoration project we're doing in Northumberland. So hopefully that endangered butterfly is going to benefit from the work we're doing as well. And shortly we'll have webinars on native orchids coming up pretty soon as well. So we have some fantastic things planned for 2025. And I will include the link in the chat before too long to share the workshop and events page of our website. All right, so I will hop into my presentation now about the lost species of the Oak Ridges Moraine. This is a topic that I'm really excited that I get to present on tonight. And it spans a long geographic and historical period and covers a pretty comprehensive range of history of this really interesting part of the world and some of the major changes in the biodiversity and ecology of this region that we've experienced over the past several thousand years, but past 300 years in particular. So this is the lost species of the Oak Ridges Moraine. I'll stop for a second just so you can take a look at this illustration. This is an illustration showing 19th century hunting of a bird called the passenger pigeon, which was in the graphic for this presentation that went out on social media and in our newsletter. This bird was one of the most common species on Earth. We'll talk about it in detail later on, but their populations were between 3 to 5 billion with a B individual birds. It's impossible for us to comprehend just how many of these birds there were. At the time that Europeans first arrived in this part of the world. And within a few hundred years of hunting and habitat loss, they were completely extinct by the year 1911. This photograph shows just how huge some of those flocks were. There's all these great oral histories about flocks of passenger pigeons filling up the skies and people thinking it was some sort of like cataclysmic or biblical event when, they would block out the sun. And these flocks would be made up of millions of individual birds. And it would sometimes take hours for them to pass over in those giant flocks. And people could just stand there and just shoot with a shotgun and kill hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of birds. And with new railway lines that were introduced, they were able to sell these birds to markets in cities. and just absolutely decimate them and make a lot of money doing it. And that's unfortunately what led to their extinction. So we'll start off. A very long time ago in this part of the world with the Wisconsin glaciation. So this is the last glacial period. It was between about 75 and 11,000 years ago. And if you look at that map there, it shows on the left, it shows the last glacial maximum. So everywhere on that map that's black shows where the extent of the glaciers at the last glacial maximum. So between about 75 and 11,000 years ago, that's how far the glaciers were. So all of what we now call Southern Ontario was completely covered in glaciers. In what we now call Toronto, there was a sheet of ice about 2 kilometers thick at the last glacial maximum. A sheet of ice that would have been taller than the CN Tower is now. It's absolutely wild to think about. And this is a picture on the right showing a glacier in Alaska today. So this is approximately, what the Oak Ridges Moraine or downtown Toronto would have looked like, 75 to 11,000 years ago. And as the glaciers retreated, as part of the Wisconsin glaciation, it left what we now call Southern Ontario, a very tundra-like landscape. It scraped away all of the soil. It formed a lot of the, familiar geological formations that we know. Most famously, the Oak Ridges Moraine itself, which is like a long ridge running from, the Niagara Escarpment down to south of Rice Lake out by Port Hope, extending hundreds of kilometers across the landscape that was formed by glacial meltwater about 10 to 12,000 years ago as the glaciers retreated. Um, we see things like Kettle Lakes. That's where there was huge chunks of ice left behind in the landscape that melted away and left these huge indentations in the landscape. There's all sorts of other great formations, things like eskers, which are almost like like a long ridge. Drumlins, which are sort of a teardrop or raindrop shaped hill that and till plains, which is when the glaciers left behind all sorts of rocks and pebbles and things like that. So these photos, which are from modern day Alaska, Northwest Territories, Yukon, they sort of show what this part of the world would have looked like roughly about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Um, According to Western archaeologists, this is when the first humans arrived in the region, although it's important to acknowledge and respect the fact that in many indigenous worldviews, indigenous peoples have always been here on Turtle Island. It's not that perspective isn't always given space in these kinds of discussions. And this is also when plants and animals start to return to the landscape. As you can imagine, with a giant ice sheet, very slowly retreating, totally scraping clean the landscape. There's no plants underneath. It was a totally dead landscape, but very slowly, species which were able to exist in the south, where there was no glaciers, were able to slowly migrate and move back north and fill our landscape. We talk a little bit about the return of wildlife and plants. Some of the first species to return would have been things like black spruce and fireweed, species that we have in the very, that are plentiful in the Canadian territories, in tundra-like landscapes, in the farthest northern parts of Ontario. These hardy species would have been some of the first to migrate north, and they would have been able to tolerate those tundra-like conditions. There's a picture I have on the left here showing a common earthworm, and just as an interesting aside, there's actually no earthworms that are native to what we call Ontario today. All of them would have gone extinct during the last glaciation, and species of plant like black spruce and fireweed actually migrated further north and were able to become part of the landscape more quickly than worms have been able to. And so all the worms we have in Ontario today were introduced from Europe, like the common earthworm, or from farther south in the United States after the arrival of European settlers, which is interesting to think about. Of course, the most interesting thing about this period for a lot of people is the Pleistocene megafauna. The Pleistocene refers to that geological period of, the age of mammals after the Mesozoic, after the time of the dinosaurs. And probably the most iconic species of this geological period is the woolly mammoth. And I'm happy to report that we had woolly mammoths right here in what we now call Southern Ontario. Um, there's lots of paleontological remains, lots of pieces of tusk, lots of bones um, have been found all across the southern part of the province. We only missed them, unfortunately, by about 10 to 12,000 years, which in geological time really isn't very long at all. Um, and if you think about it, they evolved alongside all the species that are still present in the landscape today. Um, so as we'll talk about as we go further through the presentation, they really are like a missing piece of our landscape. So it's a little bit humbling and interesting to think about the fact that the mammoths are supposed to be here. Species like that are supposed to still be here. Some of the other species that would have been a part of this landscape that are now extinct were species like the American mastodon and the stag moose. One of the really interesting species that was present in Ontario during the Pleistocene, 10 or 12,000 years ago, was a species which is called the Toronto subway deer, Trontoceros. It was first discovered by paleontologists in the 1970s. Toronto city workers were digging a tunnel in downtown Toronto as part of the subway line extension that was going on in the 70s, and they found this weird fossilized deer skull and antlers. And you can see that picture there on the bottom left. It's on display in the ROM. You can go see it today. And it's the only specimen that's ever been found in the world. And so the scientists named it Trontoceros, which translates from Latin as Toronto horn. And so that species would have been a part of the landscape. And interestingly, we've never found another specimen of that. It's the only one that's ever been found in the world. Another interesting species that has gone extinct that would have been a part of that, the biodiversity of that period was the giant pika. So today we have pikas that live in, up high up in the alpine regions of, like Yukon and northern British Columbia, places like that. They're little tiny mammals that kind of look like chinchillas that live way up in the tops of mountains. But we've found fossilized remains from southern Ontario of giant pikas, much larger than their contemporary living ancestors. Who else was on the landscape, 10 or 12,000 years ago? We found fossils from some am and other animals that are still alive today, but which we obviously don't have in southern Ontario anymore. Things like the caribou, the muskox, although those fossils in particular are a little bit contentious. It gets a little bit tricky once you get into some of the other bovids. A lot of their bones look very similar and grizzly bears. There's a bear skull also on display at the ROM, a fossilized grizzly bear skull found in southern Ontario. So all these species, 10 or 12,000 years ago when southern Ontario was the very tundra-like landscape um, immediately after the glaciers retreated, would have been present here. There's a few other fossilized species that might have also, been part of that landscape. We might have had things like shrub ox. We might have had fossilized, what they call antique bison or prehistoric bison. The ancestors of the modern bison might have been in southern Ontario. There's been a few contentious fossils of those as well. If anyone's ever been to the Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto, there's a cool fossil that was found there of the two front incisors from a giant beaver called Castroides, which date back to about 130,000 years ago. And this, when I say giant beaver, they probably could have grown to about 7 feet in length, and they could have weighed perhaps as much as 200 pounds, making them, about the size of like a small black bear. And so those were there, at least 130,000 years ago. There's been fossils found of this species a little bit further to the south in places like Ohio, which date back to about 10 or 12,000 years ago. So they might have survived in what is now southern Ontario that recently as well. So what happened to all the mammoths? Why don't we have mammoths in southern Ontario anymore? It's a fantastic question. There's basically three major theories as to why we no longer have mammoths and many of the other species of Pleistocene megafauna in southern Ontario. Some paleontologists and archaeologists think that the first humans hunted them to extinction. And there seems to be a good body of evidence that a lot of these animals were hunted and butchered and consumed by humans. I have a picture there of a Clovis point, which is a distinct style of projectile point associated with one of the first archaeological cultures found in Turtle Island, which dates back to about 13,000 years ago. and they're found in association with mammoth kill sites. And there, appears to be, scraper marks on, the mammoth fossils and things like that. And if you look at maps of human migration and the timeline of human migration, and correlate it to the most recent fossils of a lot of Pleistocene megafauna species globally. There seems to be a really strong correlation between when humans first arrived in places and when these large animals start to go extinct. There are some exceptions to this, and it's a little bit complicated. There are some cases with things like giant ground sloths where humans seem to have coexisted with them for a while in what's now Latin America. Um, so it is a little bit contentious as to whether humans actually were fully responsible through overhunting for the extinction of these species. It might have been the spread of disease, what some archaeologists and paleontologists jokingly call the over-ill hypothesis. And it could have been climate change, as we've seen in those past slides. When the glaciers first retreated, it was a very tundra-like landscape. As they retreated further and things began to warm up, and there was that sort of progression of the landscape into what we have now with deciduous and mixed wood forests and species from further south used to warmer climates moving in place. Um, that might have pushed out some of these species which were more adapted to colder climates and tundra-like conditions. So that might have been a factor in the extinction of these species, or it could have been some combination of all three. We'll likely never know for sure, although every year a few papers come out which claim to, sort of definitively have solved this. And there's lots of sort of popular science articles in, National Geographic and Scientific American, 2 or 3 times a year that are like, archaeologists have finally figured this out. But it's probably one of those things that we'll never be able to fully parse out and reach a consensus on. So this is something that's really interesting to me and something that I think about a lot when I'm walking around downtown Toronto. These two species, the Kentucky coffee tree and the honey locust, they're not native to the Oak Ridges Moraine or the GTA, but they are native to southern Ontario, right around places like Windsor in that part of the world, right around Lake Erie. They're two species of tree, and they actually evolved to have their seeds dispersed by Pleistocene megafauna. There's no living mammals or other animals which are capable of eating these seed pods, passing those seeds through their digestive tracts and excreting them and spreading them. They would have depended on things like woolly mammoths, mastodons, and ground sloths. So every time I walk in downtown Toronto and I see these, because they're both quite common street trees, I think that, this is a little piece of the Pleistocene that's still around. Honey locusts also have these really sharp thorns on them, which would have, prevented browsing of their vegetation by some of that megafauna as well. And there's no extant mammals in this part of the world that feed on these seed pods or feed on these trees. Deer don't go after them. Um, None of the herbivores that we have on the landscape today are really interested in them. Another great example of that from Mexico is the avocado. And those would have been consumed by things like Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths. And same thing, the seeds would have passed through their digestive tracts and it would have helped spread the seeds. Roughly around the same time that those species, the mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths went extinct, was also around the time that some of these species, particularly the avocado tree, were being cultivated by humans for the first time. And so the major factor that spreads the seeds of these plants nowadays are humans, human cultivation. So something I alluded to in our introduction here today that the importance of which really can't be overstated was indigenous land management and stewardship. It had a huge impact on the landscape of what is now referred to as Southern Ontario for thousands and thousands of years. And a lot of the time when we think about European colonizers first arriving here, the narrative we get is sort of like this primeval, untouched forest. But that really erases just how advanced indigenous management practices were, how extensive they were, how knowledgeable indigenous peoples were, and just the massive scale that indigenous peoples have been able to and continue to be able to impact the landscape to help conserve the species out there. Um, Prescribed burns, as I mentioned, in the context of that of the Kirtland's Warbler restoration site out in Northumberland, had a huge impact on the landscape. A lot of people don't realize just how much of southern Ontario was covered by grassland, by oak savannas, by prairies. We usually don't associate that with when we think of southern Ontario, but that was a huge part of the landscape, and those were maintained for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples who would seasonally burn the landscape, and that would help open things up. It would, enable species like the northern bobwhite, a type of quail, to thrive. Game species like the white-tailed deer would benefit as well. It was a way of regenerating the landscape and helping to conserve the biodiversity of this place. Um, all that starts to go out the window after the arrival of European colonizers. So the first explorers to reach what we now call southern Ontario from Western Europe was in the early 1600s, people like Etienne Brulé and Samuel de Champlain. Um, I have just a few points here of some of the major moments in the history of European colonization of this region. But similar to what I mentioned earlier with the Kirtland's Warbler case, a lot of these land management practices, and indeed, so many, absolutely essential cultural practices of First Nations peoples are violently suppressed, outlawed. Um, and so we really get into this management routine of like no controlled burns for several hundred years. And it has a huge impact both on First Nations people um, as well as the landscape itself. And that's not the only way that European colonizers, dramatically changed the landscape. So there's the clearing of the Carolinian forest in southern Ontario, around Lake Erie and southern Lake Huron, as well as the mixed wood forests in the Oak Ridges Moraine region around the GTA, sort of up north through, the Kawarthas and, Peterborough County and places like that. We lose a huge number of trees. Um, the lands, so many forests are cleared for settlement, for farming in particular, and so much of our forest cover is lost today. Um, we see, as I mentioned before, we lose over 97% of our grasslands and prairies. A lot of that gets converted into farmland, and nowadays a lot of that farmland is converted into subdivisions, into monster houses owned by millionaires. Um, Summer houses and things like that. So it's yeah, really not the best use of some really really valuable part of the landscape here, particularly around the GTA and particularly in the Oak Ridges Moraine. Um, we see overfishing and overhunting, the persecution of predators, things like wolves and black bears and cougars and things like that, which we'll start to get into. As I mentioned before, the passenger pigeon was hunted to extinction. This is a picture here from the late 19th century showing a bunch of ducks that were shot, I think, in Ashbridges Bay around Toronto to be brought into markets and sold commercially. So you can imagine just like the massive scale of birds in particular, wild birds that were being shot to be sold in markets. And of course, the clearing of wetlands, something which unfortunately, particularly under the current provincial government, is continuing today. We've lost a huge percentage of the wetlands in southern Ontario, and to the point where a species like the king rail is their numbers are way, 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 way down in the province, and they're almost extirpated. If you read the species at risk resort for the report for this species from a few years ago, we're not sure if they even still breed here. They still occur in Ontario annually, this marsh bird, but way fewer of them than there were historically. And that's very closely associated with the loss of wetlands and the draining of wetlands for development and farms. There's some major changes to our waterways and lakes. Here's a picture showing the Trent Severn Canal System, which I know is, a big source of local pride for people out in Peterborough and the Kawarthas, but that has huge impacts on the health of lakes, on rivers, waterways, wetlands, particularly in relation to the migration of, fish and other aquatic species, which need to migrate through. And of course, urbanization and development. This is a photo from a few years ago showing the skyline of Toronto, and yeah, it just really puts into perspective just how much of Southern Ontario is developed and been turned into towns, cities, communities. So to take it back to the passenger pigeon, here's a picture of two taxidermy passenger pigeons. If you're ever interested in seeing a stuffed passenger pigeon yourself, they have a couple on display at the ROM behind the scenes in the collections. If you're ever lucky enough to go there, they have the largest collection of passenger pigeons in the world. There's, I think, over 50 of them, taxidermied passenger pigeons. And the last one was one named Martha that died in the Ohio Zoo in Cincinnati in 1911. And as I mentioned before, at their peak, there was between 3 to 5 million of these birds. They were one of the most common birds in the world. And they obviously had a massive impact on the ecology of the region. They were a major, they ate a lot of oak acorns, and the loss of the passenger pigeon and the loss of so many oak trees and mixed deciduous forests where oaks were part of that forest cover has had a massive impact on the regeneration of forests in southern Ontario and throughout eastern North America, as well as the makeup of those forests, the overall health of those forests. It's really difficult to overstate just like how what a significant factor they were and what a significant influence they were on the landscape. And there's a few sort of signs of their presence in southern Ontario today. Mimico, the neighborhood in, around Oshawa, Mississauga, and Toronto, one of the GO train stops, comes from the Ojibwe word for place of the passenger pigeon. Omimi, out by Peterborough, has that same root word. Omimi, um, I've heard was an onomatopoeic representation of the call of the passenger pigeon. It would have, sort of made like a me sound. Um, and that's where that name comes from. And of course, Pigeon Lake, right by Omimi in the Pigeon River, also have that same etymology. So there's a few traces of their presence on the landscape today, the passenger pigeon. Another species which has gone from the Oak Ridges Moraine and from southern Ontario is the elk. So there was either a population, a subpopulation, or a subspecies called the eastern elk, which is now extinct, which extended through, eastern Canada into the northeastern US, throughout New England, New Brunswick, Quebec, places like that. And they were totally hunted to extinction I believe, by the end of the 19th century. There are a few small reintroduced populations of elk that were brought back to Ontario in the 80s and 90s by the Ministry of Natural Resources as part of a sort of an interesting program they had going on at the time. So if you're extremely lucky and you're in the Tweed and Bancroft area, if you're around Nipissing, if you're on the north shore of Lake Huron, around Sault Ste. Marie, or in the, Rainy River district, by like Fort Francis, there's a chance that you can come across elk, but they're genetically different because they're, reintroduced from the western part of the continent than their ancestors in this region would have been. And they're very small populations. And I'm not sure how well they're sustaining themselves or, what the sort of the long-term outcomes are for those populations. Um, yeah, it's amazing to think about. We'll get into it a little bit, but if you read, naturalists' accounts or early histories, you have records of things like black bears, elk, and cougar, all the way down into places like Point Pelee and right around Windsor, Ontario, in like Essex County. So species like the elk, which we think of as being like a Western Canadian animal or like a Western American animal, um, they were, just like the mammoths and the mastodons and all these other species, they were a part of this landscape for thousands and thousands of years. And all the animals that are still around in this part of the world evolved alongside them. So we can only really start to speculate about some of the gaps represented by the loss of that species. What were the relationships between the elk and the plants that they fed on, and how did they influence the landscape around them? Really interesting to think about those sorts of questions. Another species which is gone from all of eastern Canada and the eastern US is the cougar, or um, also known as the mountain lion. Now, every once in a while, there's rumors, reports, blurry photos, kind of like a Sasquatch sighting of cougars in Ontario. The consensus is that these are either escaped pets, and in one case, I believe, from about 15 years ago, there was a dead cougar that escaped from somebody's like private zoo, Tiger King style somewhere in the province. Um, or they're misidentifications. We do have bobcats and Canada lynx in the province. And someone driving at night on a back road who's not particularly familiar with these species, it's easy enough. Or even a house cat, in the right conditions. You get a big cat like a Mancoon, and you can confuse these things for one another. Um, so the scientific consensus is there is no cougar population in Ontario. Just like the eastern elk, there was a subpopulation or subspecies, that was known as the eastern cougar, which is extinct now. The only part of eastern North, U.S. and Canada where there are cougars extant is in Florida today, where they're very endangered and they exist in the Everglades. Um, However, recently there's been some interesting reports which have been scientifically verified, trail cam footage and things like that, and well-documented tracks in the snow from Wisconsin, from Superior National Forest, where they're very rarely reported, and Michigan, including some tracks which were found about 100 kilometers from the Ontario border around Sault Ste. Marie in 2023. So it's conceivable that sometime in the next, 10, 20, 30 years, we could have a genuine wild cougar sighting in Ontario. Um, yeah, so if you live in Sault Ste. Marie or, in that part of the world, keep your eyes open over the next little while. But yeah, the cougar, much like the elk, black bear, they were found all throughout southern Ontario, all the way, in the Lake Erie, Lake Ontario region. Another interesting species, which has, been totally extirpated from the province, was the Lake Ontario population of the Atlantic salmon. Um, Lake Ontario, being connected to the Atlantic Ocean, this was a population of Atlantic salmon that were, totally cut off because of glaciation, I believe. I might have this wrong. Um, and sort of became genetically distinct and isolated for several tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Um, but they were so heavily overfished that by 1896 they became extirpated. There's some great records from the 19th century of prisoners in the Don Jail on the Don River in Toronto, um, where they wrote basically a letter of protest to their jailers, to the wardens, complaining that they were being fed too much fresh salmon that was being caught in the Don River. Um, they were begging to be fed something else instead of, fresh salmon every night. Um, but by 1896, the fishing was so intense and on such an industrial scale that the Atlantic salmon became extirpated from Lake Ontario. So we've lost that genetically distinct isolated population of Atlantic salmon. However, there's been a lot of reintroduction efforts. Millions of dollars in funding has been spent to try to bring back the Atlantic salmon to Ontario. But as of now, there's no self-sufficient population. There's a few non-native salmonoid species, things like the Chinook salmon, the rainbow trout, brown trout, which aren't native to Ontario, which have been introduced. And, if you go into some of the creeks around the GTA in the fall, you can see the Chinook salmon running. But those aren't native to here. Those are from Western Canada. So here are a few of the mammals that have been extirpated from the Oak Ridges Moraine region. Things like the bobcat, the Canada lynx, the wolf, um, and the moose. Although there was a really great sighting of a moose in Markham in 2017 out on the 400, out on the highway there. There's photos of it. It was verified. The Ministry of Natural Resources tried to find this moose to track it down and tranquilize it so they could relocate it to, further north in the province. But it was never found. So we have no idea what happened to that moose that wandered into Markham in 2017. But that was definitely a very lost animal. These species all used to, like the cougar and the elk and the black bear, they were distributed all through southern Ontario, all through Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Um, there's records of wolves, moose, elk in the GTA, into the mid 19th century. There's a really great publication as part of this series that the City of Toronto put out that's like the Mammals of Toronto Guide. They have one for birds, for spiders, for trees, all of these different, taxa. They're available at some of the public libraries in Toronto for free. They're really excellent. There's PDF copies available online as well. I'd really recommend checking those out. And they do a good job of sort of talking about the history of these species in the region as well. Here are some of the rarer mammals of the Oak Ridges Moraine. So these species were also have been largely pushed out of this region. The American marten in particular, it's a member of the weasel family, extremely rare in southern Ontario. Basically, you know, basically extirpated, but present in very, very rare. Black bears are present in the Oak Ridges Moraine in small numbers. I have a friend who's done field work for the Toronto Zoo and their Blandings turtle head starting program in the Rouge, and there are black bears in the Rouge, and I've been out there hiking, and there are signs out there. So they weren't sure for a while whether that was like a bear that had gotten lost again and ended up there, but they think it probably is just a very, very small resident group or resident individual, maybe. So, right around the GTA, there are bears. I know a family member of mine saw one outside of Belleville once, right out front of the Walmart. Out by the highway. So they show up in unexpected places. The Fisher, another member of the weasel family, they're extremely secretive and hard to track down. If anyone here has ever seen a Fisher in the wild, I'm very jealous of you. I'd love to see one someday. They're present in the Oak Ridges Moraine, but in greatly reduced numbers versus how many were here historically. And much like the marten, the black bear, and these other species which have been extirpated locally, it has to do with development. These are all species which respond poorly to human changes to the habitat. If you think about things like raccoons, um, those are the sorts of mammals that respond well to human modified landscapes and human changes to the environment. These species, not so much. And that's why they're absent now, or largely absent. This is a species of butterfly, which is now extirpated from Ontario, called the Karner Blue. It's associated with prairie habitats, tall grass prairie ecosystems, oak savannas. Historically, they were present even in a place like High Park in Toronto. There's records from them there. Their host plant is the wild blue lupin, Lupin perennis, which is this is a photo I took out around Long Point last spring. It's a really gorgeous native wildflower we have, which is also associated with those habitat types, your oak savannas, they like that sort of sandy soil. And it's become, quite uncommon provincially because of development. And because, places like Hyde Park in Toronto lost a lot of their blue lupin, and a lot of these habitats were converted to farmland. The Karner Blue is now completely absent from Canada and from Ontario, although it persists in the United States where it's still endangered. Give me one second here. This is the frosted elfin. This is another prairie butterfly species. Also depends on the wild blue lupin as its host plant, and it's also extirpated from Ontario and Canada, but it still exists in the United States. If anyone's not familiar with the word extirpated, it means extinct in one location, absent from one location, but it still exists elsewhere. So an animal like the passenger pigeon, which is extinct, it doesn't exist anywhere on Earth, but an extirpated species like the frosted elfin, no longer in Canada or Ontario or the Oak Ridges Moraine, but still found in the US. This is the northern bobwhite. This is a really interesting bird, one that I'd really love to see. I know people who were able to see or hear what was probably the last population of this bird in Ontario. It was in a place in the St. Clair River called Walpole Island First Nation, it's unceded land out there. Had a small population of these birds. They're a tiny little quail, and southern Ontario represents the very northern extent of their range. As you can see from this map from the Government of Ontario, from their species at risk assessment, they once ranged all the way up north to like Kingston, Ontario. And it's a little bit convoluted what their original distribution was in the province at the time that European colonizers first arrived, they might have only really existed around places like Essex County, in the oak savannas and tallgrass prairie out there. But with a lot of the clearing of the landscape, with deforestation, with the conversion of forests to agricultural fields, that helped them expand their range a lot throughout the province. So they, moved, as far north and as far east as places like Kingston and along the north shore of Lake Ontario, when they probably weren't present there originally. But with changes in agricultural practices, the conversion of small family farms into massive industrial scale farms, the loss of things like hedgerows, the widespread use of, chemical insecticides, their numbers plummeted. They also don't respond well to cold winters. Um, and I remember talking to a great birder out in the Peel area this past May called Jeremy Hatt, who was talking about, this story from the 1970s of there being like a really cold winter and people finding all these dead bobwhites throughout Point Pelee, and their population never being able to really recover from that. There hasn't been any formal sightings of this bird, like verified sightings of this bird, um, in over 10 years now in Ontario. As I said, the last population was out on Walpole Island, First Nation, um, and lots and lo of people have been out there looking for them without much luck. There are a few local residents who've reported, hearing them. So there's hope that they're still there, and we shouldn't discount those, the knowledge of local people and their relationship with these birds and with the landscape. Um, Right now is the third Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. We're heading into the final year of it. So it'll be interesting to see once all those information from all those breeding bird surveys comes out, whether we conclude that they're extirpated or not. Um, they're still listed as as endangered in the province, but because it's been so long since they've been formally cited, there's a very strong chance that they're gone from the province now, and that seems to be the consensus with a lot of birders and a lot of naturalists. Another species which is almost entirely gone from the region is the American eel. Um, they were once a massive part of the fish biomass in this province. So they once accounted for about 50% of the total weight or mass of all the fish um, in Southern Ontario, which is incredible. There's great oral histories again from the Kawarthas region of, First Nations peoples using spears in the winter to go ice fishing and taking out just, like piles and piles and piles of eels that were in the lakes there. And there's this concept we have in biology called shifting baseline syndrome. And it's people's sense of what the landscape naturally looks like, or what is a natural part of the flora and fauna of a place, shifts over time as and so it's hard for us to think about how things would have been in the recent past, or how things were supposed to be if it weren't for, the dramatic impact of things like, the Trent Severn waterway or hydroelectric dams. So we really have this amnesia culturally about just what a massive part of the biodiversity of this province the American eel once was. In the past 100 years, their populations have declined by over 99%. So they've been decimated by hydro dams, canals like the Trent Severn waterway. They have a real cultural significance to the Anishinaabe, and we're a really important source of food historically. Um, these fish migrate through the St. Lawrence out to the Atlantic Ocean. They breed in the Sargasso Sea out by Bermuda, thousands and thousands of kilometers away. They have an absolutely incredible life history. But with all these changes we've made to the Great Lakes, with all the canals we put in and things like that, and with the hydroelectric dams in particular, they just get chopped up into pieces when they go through the hydro dam turbines, and it makes their migration out to the Atlantic to breed almost impossible. I was at Presqu'île Provincial Park a few years ago on a birding trip, and we found a dead eel on the beach, and it was the most exciting moment of the day for a lot of the naturalists who were there with us. And it was, the first record of this fish in the park for so many years, and people were so excited that a single dead eel was on the beach. That's how rare they are. Another species which is almost entirely gone from the landscape is the Henslow's sparrow. This is another species which is sort of associated with grasslands. Um, And much like the bobwhite, their range expanded throughout the province after European colonizers came here and converted a lot of forest into farmland. But as with all those changes with agricultural practices, the conversion of small family farms with things like hedgerows into, massive industrial scale farms, the loss of a lot of farms to development, their populations have disappeared dramatically. So they used to, again, they would range out all the way, east, further east than Kingston, all the way up, on the Bruce Peninsula. Today they're very rare. I'm only aware of one breeding pair in the province at one spot in southern Ontario, which has been there for the past few years. They didn't return last spring or last summer, but there's a few sightings of these birds in migration each year. Oftentimes they'll show up towards the tip at Point Pelee around a particular tree called the Serengeti tree. If you're a real bird nerd, you may have heard of it. But they're a species which is dramatically declined in Ontario and is almost totally absent from the landscape as well. So who's next? I know it's a little bit grim, but these are all species at risk which are found in the Oak Ridges Moraine today. We have things like the short-eared owl, the golden-winged warbler, the red-side dace, Blanding's turtle, the little brown bat, American ginseng. There are a lot of species which are severely threatened by things like development, climate change, the loss of habitat, um, pollution, even things like poaching species like turtles in particular are very vulnerable to poaching for the pet trade. Things like ginseng and golden seal are used in traditional medicine, used by herbalists. So there are a lot of species which are sort of on the precipice, which have experienced dramatic population declines, dramatic declines in their range, but who still exist here and still have hope to continue to exist in this part of the world throughout the moraine. Here are some of the major threats we're dealing with. Many of them I've mentioned already, things like climate change. We see the effects of extreme weather in this province. We saw that, massive Jericho a few years ago, that giant storm that took down so many trees. We see, that flood in Toronto a few months ago that caused over $1 billion in damage. Things are only going to get worse in the province. There's all these climate models that Audubon put out a few years ago predicting the changes in the ranges of North American birds as the global temperatures rise by a few degrees Celsius over the next 100 years. Things like the common loon are probably going to become far less common in southern Ontario as climate change affects the suitability of their habitat and impacts things like water clarity in the lakes where they breed. So that's a major factor. The weakening of environmental protections and laws. Don't have to speak too much to that. That is a major issue we're experiencing in the province right now. Development and habitat loss, pesticides, even something like outdoor cats. The number one killer of migratory birds in Canada, in North America, it isn't windows, isn't wind turbines, although those things all impact them. It's actually outdoor cats. One of the easiest things you can do to help um, preserve wild animals, particularly birds, amphibians, reptiles, small mammals, is to keep your cats indoors. Window strikes. That's another huge threat to migratory birds. A lot of birds don't register glass as a solid object. They see the reflection of the trees around them and they fly right into it. Road mortality, huge issue with turtles, with reptiles, anything that's slow moving, particularly as so many wetlands are bisected by roads and development, and poaching, as we talked about already, things like ginseng, turtles, particularly for the pet trade. It's good to think about some of the local conservation efforts and some of the success stories. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the Wildlife Preservation Canada has reintroduced the mottled dusky wing to a few sites in the province, including the Pinery Provincial Park out on Lake Huron. And so there are some, signs of hope. Wildlife Preservation Canada has done some great work with a very endangered bird called the loggerhead shrike. There's a really cool ornithologist named Hazel Wheeler that's behind that, reintroducing this bird and breeding it in captive and releasing shrikes at Cardinalvar in the Kawarthas and Napanee Limestone Plain out by Napanee. They're a predatory songbird with a sharp beak, so they're about the size of a robin and they'll actually eat things like chickadees, which is pretty grim and cool. There's the Alderville Black Oak Savanna. That's a really incredible surviving savanna site that's out by Alderville First Nation on the south shore of Rice Lake. And that's a really incredible example of Indigenous-led conservation and just how absolutely magnificent the impacts of ecological traditional knowledge can be when they're applied on the landscape today. They do a lot of controlled burns out there. It's an absolutely incredible site, and tours are done out there sometimes. So I would love to get out there sometime and see it. That whole part of the province there, that Rice Lake Plains region is really cool and home to a lot of really neat species at risk. They have places like the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, which is doing great work. That's based out in Peterborough, helping injured turtles. There's places like the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, the Toronto Zoo, Scales, the Land Between that are doing turtle head starting. All 8 turtle species in Ontario are species at risk, even the snapping turtle and the painted turtle. So you need all the help they can get. An organization, Western Blazing or Blazing Star Environmental, has been doing Western chorus frog surveys over the past few years. Their populations of those frogs have been declining in the province for a while, and this consultancy company that's pretty new on the scene has been trying to investigate changes in their populations and where they are distributed to help the government understand their distribution and their conservation needs. And like I mentioned earlier, we're towards the end of the third Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. Thousands of birders have been going out across the province and recording all the birds they've been seeing and compiling all that data. The original Breeding Bird Atlas took place in the 80s, and then there was one around 2000. So it happens, roughly every 20, 25 years. And it's a really fantastic way to understand changes in bird populations and distribution. And you can really, if you look at things like the northern bobwhite, the barn owl, the Henslow sparrow, you can really see how their populations have declined. Even things like black tern, species, birds like that, you can really see how much rarer they've gotten. But on the other side, you can see, how species like the sandhill crane have, starting to do so much better over the past 30 or 40 years, and all the places they're starting to breed now, which they didn't appear before. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we have our Kirtland's Warbler Habitat Restoration Initiative out in Northumberland County. It's been a fantastic thing to be involved with. I got to ride on the back of that tractor thing last November, spreading acorns. I've got to do some work filming out there, interviewing people, and helping people learn about collecting native seeds. It's a really cool thing to get involved with, and it's trying to help this species, which is also pretty much gone from the landscape in Ontario. Hopefully, if we bring this habitat back, it'll come and start breeding here. A lot of our knowledge for that project comes from a similar project, which has been going on in Simcoe County to convert a part of the Simcoe County forest out there called Packard Tract into habitat for this bird. So we've gained a lot of knowledge based on the experience of people out there. And a recent success story to sort of help end things on a positive note, North American river otter was a species which was extirpated from the Greater Toronto Area for over 100 years, last seen around Toronto in the late 19th century. And around 2012, people started to report them again. And, people weren't sure for a while. They thought maybe that people were seeing minks and misidentifying them, but now they're seen regularly throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine and around Toronto. I've seen them in High Park in Toronto. People see them, out at Tommy Thompson's. Sometimes they're at Colonel Sam Smith Park in Etobicoke. So river otters, they're one of those species where initially they didn't respond well to human modified landscapes. So they were gone throughout most of southern Ontario. But now they're starting to, perhaps they're starting to tolerate the landscape a little bit more. Perhaps they're responding to, cleaner water quality in the Great Lakes since environmental regulations were passed in the 70s. Perhaps they're responding well to wetland conservation projects, and for whatever reason, they're starting to make a return. Here's a couple of success stories which are arguably too successful for some people. The reintroduction of the wild turkey in the 1980s in Toronto, or in Ontario rather. They were totally extirpated from the province for a long time due to overhunting, along with the Canada goose. Both species were reintroduced with heavy support by the hunting lobby, and they are now resident throughout much of southern Ontario. There's some controversy as to their impacts on the landscape now, and the landscape has changed so much in the past few hundred years. Canada geese, for instance, really love urban parks with the short grass, manicured lawns where they can feed, and water features at golf courses and things like that. Um, Now we have resident populations of them throughout southern Ontario that don't migrate in the way that perhaps they would have in the past. Wild turkeys are pretty omnivorous, so they have an impact on all the other species that are out there. They'll eat ground nesting birds, they'll eat salamanders and amphibians and reptiles and all sorts of stuff. Um, so these are two reintroduction projects of extirpated species which have been very successful and have perhaps starting to have negative impacts on the environment. So I'll just end things off with a few ways that you can help. Um, Activism is a huge thing. You can call your elected officials. That's always fun to give a phone call to a politician and see how they react. You can send them emails if you're socially anxious and don't want to talk to them. And support politicians who prioritize the environment. Um, that's a huge one. You can keep your cat indoors, like in this picture here. That's one of the easiest ways you can help protect biodiversity, particularly migratory birds. And indoor cats will live longer than outdoor cats. So you're protecting your cats from, being hit by cars and eaten by coyotes and things like that. You can turn off your lights during bird migration in the spring and the fall. You can apply bird-safe window treatments to your windows, those little dots that are 2 inches apart you see on new buildings, particularly downtown in the cities. Plant native species, avoid invasive species. Put in a pollinator garden. It's a great way to attract butterflies and birds and things like that to your yard. Is just start planting things like milkweed and sumac and dogwood. You can donate to organizations like the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. We are always happy to take your money. You can volunteer with us. I coordinate the volunteers at the organization, so I'm always happy to have new people coming on to volunteer. And that's the end of the presentation today. Does anyone have any questions about the Oak Ridges Moraine and the lost species here? All right, so we have Don McMaster was asking, what can we as individuals do? What would be the greatest impact? I think what would be the greatest impact? I think keeping your cats indoors is a good one. I think we're at the point in the climate emergency where um, we should all be activists. This is just my personal opinion, distinct from, being an employee of the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. I think we should all be holding our leaders accountable. We should all be talking to our friends and our neighbors, and doing everything we can. Um, at this point, we really have to reduce the amount of carbon we're putting in the environment and try to cut back the rise of global temperatures to try to make sure that the planet is still livable in the next few hundred years. So anything we can do um, to help stem climate change politically through educating the people around us, advocacy work, reaching out to politicians, volunteering for organizations. I think all that is really important. Another question in the chat. Christine says, thanks for an informative presentation. Thank you, Christine. Jane Garthson says, thank you for very interesting info. Dawn also says, great presentation. Does anyone else have any questions for me today? All right, well, if that's everything, well, thank you for a wild ride. Thank you so much. I know it's not every day you go from mastodons and mammoths to outdoor cats eating birds, but that's how we do things here at the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. Thank you all for joining me this evening. I always love talking about this stuff. I'll put quickly the link in the chat for the volunteer page on the website and the events page on the website if anyone wants to grab that. So that's the link for the volunteer page. And for the events page, I will throw that in as well. And then I will also throw in, thank you everyone, my email address at the Land Trust. If anyone or wants to get in touch, ask questions about birds, what have you, I am always free to chat. All right. And yeah, thanks everyone who's joined us today and who's been a part of this throughout the year. It's been great to bring all these walks and webinars and events to everybody. And I look forward to having you all join me in the new year for more great educational outreach stuff. Have a happy holidays and a happy new year. And we will, oh, link for donations, somebody says. That's a great point, Christine. Link for donations. Give me 1 second here. All right, there's the link for donations. Um, all right, I will chat with you all soon, and everybody have a nice evening. Bye now.